Welcome to today's Scientists Answer Your Questions webinar, brought to you by GrassrootsHealth. Thank you everyone for attending. This week, we are broadcasting an interview with Dr. Adrian Gombart of the Linus Pauling Institute and Grassroots Health Director Carole Baggerly, which was recorded at the Linus Pauling's recent conference on diet and optimum health. Dr. Gombart is the principal investigator for the Linus Pauling Institute at Oregon State University and is associate professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics. Dr. Gombart and his team are investigating how vitamin D deficiency affects the immune system and the potential of vitamin D supplementation to boost immune response and reduce infections. And with that, we are pleased to bring you this interview on vitamin D and the immune system.
All right, today we have with us Dr. Adrian Gombart, otherwise known as Fritz Gombart, at least that's how he signs his emails. He's actually from the Linus Pauling Institute and works here, and Dr. Gombart is part of the Grassroots Health Vitamin D research panel, so I happen to have the privilege of knowing him in a couple of different contexts. But before we start talking about vitamin D, could you give us just a little scope of what the Linus Pauling Institute does and what this conference has been all about?
The Linus Pauling Institute is a collection of scientists who are now actually in their own building, which is the Linus Pauling Science Center, which was
very beautiful building
within the last 2 years. And everyone's working basically on basic research questions related to nutrition. So everybody has sort of their favorite nutrient or nutrients that they work on. And we're working in 3 different disease areas: healthy aging, and which is not really disease, but the idea is to prevent disease or reduce disease so that you can live a long, healthy life. And we have a cancer and chemoprevention, and groups that work on nutrients that are related to cancer prevention.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have folks working on oxidative stress and how those contribute to cardiovascular disease. And
may I interrupt just a moment on the healthy aging?
Yes.
The gentleman that I was just speaking with, another gentleman, we were talking about aging, and I commented that based on what I'm hearing at this conference about micronutrients and certainly all their many deficiencies,
mm-hmm.
I am of the conclusion that unhealthy aging is, or maybe aging other than just adding years, is really a micronutrient deficiency problem.
I mean, we're going to age.
Yes, we will get older.
The idea is to if you think of aging as a process, well, we generally think of aging as something where you're sort of moving along, and then you hit a certain point and you start to decline. Mm-hmm. Your health starts declining, mm-hmm. and you go into this long, sometimes rapid or slow decline.
Right.
And I think what we'd like to see is through diet and nutrition, getting adequate amounts of what we need as far as nutrients. Try to get that curve so that it's going like this for mm-hmm. most of your life, mm-hmm. and then there may be that short drop off, so that while you are alive, you're enjoying it.
Absolutely.
Rather than spending the last several years perhaps not enjoying it as much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and so part of that would probably be looking younger than you would be mm-hmm. if you weren't eating proper mm-hmm. foods and getting the right adequate nutrients.
Okay. Tell me about your work.
We're working primarily on vitamin D, and we had made a discovery that vitamin D could regulate an antimicrobial peptide, and this would be a peptide that actually has the ability to kill bacterial pathogens and even viral pathogens. And we think that the fact that vitamin D regulates this explains some of the phenomena you see with deficiency, where if someone's severely deficient, they're generally unhealthy, more susceptible to infections. You see dental abscesses and those sorts of things with real severe vitamin D deficiency. And it may also explain why the sources of vitamin D were used back in the early part of the 1900s to treat tuberculosis. And so sanatoriums where people were put out in the sunlight seemed to be effective, and cod liver oil was also used. And there were even, once they had identified vitamin D, there were even treatments with really high levels of vitamin D for lupus vulgaris, which is a mycobacterium, a mycobacterium infection in the skin. And so vitamin D actually affects numerous proteins involved in immune response, but this was sort of a very direct regulation of a protein that could actually kill pathogens. And so what we've been interested in is understanding how vitamin D regulation of this gene and the expression of this protein is how it's involved in immune response against infection. And one thing that we also discovered was that the regulation of this particular gene is by vitamin D is specific to humans and non-human primates. So it's not something that other mammals have acquired. And we know that, for example, mice, which are a common laboratory animal model, they don't have this regulation of vitamin D by this regulation of this cathelicidin gene by vitamin D. So what we did was we used a molecular approach to create we call a transgenic animal mouse, and we took the human gene and put it into the mice. And so by doing this, the mice are carrying the human gene, which is regulated by vitamin D. And then we breed these mice with another mouse, which is lacking the actual mouse gene.
Right.
Call that a knockout mouse.
Right.
And now we have mice that are missing the mouse gene and carrying the human gene.
Right.
And this human gene responds to vitamin D, and we're in the process of now doing some in vivo or in the animal modeling of infectious diseases to see how, let's say, for example, you could model an influenza infection in the mouse, and you could look at how the response of the mouse to the influenza is what's happening during that response, and look at whether vitamin D status might affect the way the mouse can respond, and whether it's more susceptible or less susceptible to influenza. And we can do this with other diseases as well. And we're quite interested in looking at tuberculosis, but that would be something we can do if we can get the NIH to fund us.
Of course. Funding's always an issue.
Because these are not trivial experiments. They do cost money.
Right.
But so that's one area of research that we're pursuing.
Come back to the comment about they can regulate the genes and control, kill, whatever, the bacteria, the viruses. How much effect? I mean, I'm sure it varies by the disease or whatever, but how big is the effect? For example, in influenza.
How important is it?
Yes, how important?
Well, actually, with influenza, we don't really know what role this particular protein plays in the response against influenza. And that's actually something that we are starting to look at in animals.
Right.
Like I said, we have the mouse that's lacking this gene, and we've started some work with this knockout mouse and comparing it to the wild type mouse.
Right.
And we want to see what we can answer. The question we can answer with that sort of model is whether the mouse is more susceptible to the influenza infection if it's missing this gene. And if we find that to be the case, then we can do experiments with our mouse that carries the human gene and see if regulating the expression of the gene with vitamin D will alter the susceptibility of the mouse to the influenza. There are other diseases where the knockout mouse has been shown to be susceptible, and those include some skin infections and with bacteria, and that's another area that we could explore as well. So,
know.
but there are studies done in vitro where you can take this peptide. That's it's a very short protein, and you can culture different pathogens with it, and then look at how easily they are killed by the peptide, and we can get measurements on that. But these are in vitro; they don't quite reflect what you see during the in vivo,
Sure.
in the body type of
Sure.
infection.
Sure.
But they do give us an idea, and definitely different pathogens show different susceptibility.
Of course. There was certainly a study, and I don't remember the author at the moment, with tuberculosis, where they had a group of people who were receiving the standard treatment, and then there was a group that were receiving the standard treatment plus vitamin D, and those that got the vitamin D, they had a full sputum conversion, which I understand is a mark of non-disease, as it were.
Yeah, there's been, I think the trials that have been carried out so far with tuberculosis and vitamin D thrown in on top of the current therapies that they use have been sort of, I guess, less than satisfying.
Okay, sure.
But there was a more recent study. I think part of the problem is dosing, how much to give, when to give it. You have to make sure that when you are giving vitamin D, you're actually raising serum levels. What are those levels? And but there was a study showing in a particular genotype of individuals for the vitamin D receptor. So the vitamin D receptor has some. There are these SNPs that are associated with the vitamin D receptor. SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are changes in the sequence of the gene. One base, DNA is made up of 4 different bases, and it's a gene is determined by the sequence of those bases.
Right.
And you can have a single change, and that can have an impact on gene function. These SNPs in the VDR have been associated with different sorts of health outcomes. But in these tuberculosis patients, a certain SNP was associated with an improved sputum conversion.
Okay.
So that really is something that has to be looked at. I mean, there could be these genotypic variations in humans could determine how they respond.
Of course.
And but again, I think the studies. I think it still remains to be seen how effective vitamin D sort of therapy on top of the antibiotic treatments, how well that'll work. But there was actually a study that was published very recently, and they were actually giving very high doses of vitamin D, around 600,000 IU doses.
Oh, wow.
So the earlier
Over what
studies
time
have been
period?
around. I don't remember the details offhand right now.
That's still like an overload to the
well, much higher than the
receptors,
1
isn't
or 200,000 they've been using in these earlier the earlier studies. So I have not gone through the paper carefully. I just sort of perused it, but it did seem that they were seeing some interesting improvements in the disease. But again, not huge, but they may be showing some promise. I think one thing that we're really interested in looking at in tuberculosis is, and it's not easy to work with. You need special facilities. We do have those facilities on campus, but it's very expensive, and we do need to get the funding for that. But you do have to have special facilities and wear special gear and all that to work with virulent strains of tuberculosis that infect humans. But what we're interested in is whether vitamin D status would affect the susceptibility to the initial infection.
I had read something that Philip Liu from UCLA showed me some time ago about providing vitamin D to friends and relatives and whatever of TB patients and helping reduce the...
That would be the hope, that you might actually reduce the actual initial infection.
Exactly.
If you could boost vitamin D levels, that might actually prevent or reduce
Sure.
the rates of infection, which
Sure.
you can even make a 10% or 20% reduction in
Right.
infection rates is huge in TB. And that's one thing we can address with our animal model, we think, because you can't do those sorts of studies in humans. You can't
Right.
say, well, here's your vitamin D, now I want to try to infect you.
Right.
So with the animal model, we hope to be able to say, make an animal deficient or give the animal very high doses and compare to a normal animal, which would have a normal vitamin D status for mouse, and see if we can alter the rates of the initial infection in those animals.
How big a problem is tuberculosis? At one point in my life, before I started interviewing some of you lovely scientists, I thought it was a gone thing, but apparently it's not.
For the United States, it's not a huge health problem. It's more in the sort of developing countries where there's very high rates of TB infection and
the prognosis with the disease is?
And then there's a number of people. There's millions of people who have active infection, and if they don't get treated, it eventually can kill you, of course. And treatment's very difficult. It takes months of antibiotic treatment, and compliance with those sorts of treatments is difficult to ensure. So what happens is if you have people getting treated and then go off treatment, then you have a more serious problem. You have drug-resistant strains of TB, and those are of major concern.
Okay.
And in this country, people with immune compromised conditions, any disease that might compromise their immune system, such as HIV patients, tuberculosis, and especially drug-resistant strains, can be a real problem. So it's still a problem. I mean, worldwide, it's a problem.
Sure.
In this country, much less so, but you do find it in some of the larger cities.
Right. What other diseases do you think are of significance that you're very interested in exploring, whether or not you're doing so right now?
Diseases. So, I mean, we're interested in infectious disease, but we're actually interested in the antimicrobial peptides also been implicated in cancer.
Okay.
In some cancers, overexpression may be contributing to the development of the cancer, and in other types of cancers, maybe low expression contributes to the cancer. And there was an interesting paper that came out showing that in colon cancer, it seems that low expression occurs in those cancers and may contribute to the development of colon cancer.
Wow.
And when you have expression of this antimicrobial peptide gene, you actually see apoptosis occur, or cell death occur in these cancer cells, and so that could be beneficial. So we're interested in, a lot of our research is focused on how this gene's regulated. Vitamin D is clearly a major way that it's regulated, but we're also looking at other compounds that might regulate expression of this gene, which could be beneficial to, especially perhaps gastrointestinal health and in other aspects of immune function. But we're finding actually a number of nutrients that are studied in the LPI as well as studied by scientists in general, might be regulating the expression of this gene. And so particularly things that you obtain in plants, referred as polyphenols, plant polyphenols. And so we have some evidence that the antimicrobial peptide gene is being regulated by these. And so if you're consuming a diet that's rich in these compounds, this may increase your barrier defense in the gut. It may also contribute to gut health, because problems with the gut include infection, but inflammation, and these things can contribute to the development of cancer and other diseases, gastrointestinal diseases. So we think that the regulation of expression of this particular gene is important in gut health, and may also affect the gut microbes. And there's clearly a whole new field of research that's occurring.
The book about the gut or whatever is the second brain,
we have a whole bunch of folks living inside our gastrointestinal that are key players in our health, it looks like.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so, so that's not vitamin D, but it's a nutritional
Certainly.
question, and we kind of go where the research takes us. But as far as vitamin D, we're also interested in other aspects of immune function and how vitamin D affects those. And we're interested in developing some areas in with the aging program, looking at the importance of vitamin D to function of the immune system as we age, which tends to not function as well. So you have issues with your both your adaptive and innate immune systems. And we think vitamin D is probably playing a role in that, particularly because the elderly tend to be a population that gets inadequate or insufficient and even deficient level, or can be deficient for vitamin D. So,
I had an experience several years ago. I was a volunteer for a hospice organization, and I visited some people in a home, and they were all women. I had 4 different people that I visited, and I was amazed at the, I guess, the diet, which was
probably very boring.
very boring,
Yes,
heavily
not-
carbohydrate,
not colorful.
and no, not at all colorful. And the interior living quarters, they were inside all the time, all
Right,
the time.
Right.
And I was talking with one of the nurses at the center. The biggest single problem in the home, do you know what it is? Of the patients?
No, I don't.
Constipation.
Oh.
Now,
Makes sense.
it makes all kind of sense because you look at the diet they're eating and it's
They're not moving about much.
They're not moving. So it's very sad.
Right, and diet is not a very good source for vitamin D.
No,
just
it's
because
not.
There's limited food items
Sure,
that have vitamin
sure.
D. And if you're not getting outside in the sunlight
Right.
for a few minutes a day, you don't generate it. And if you're in Oregon,
Even if you're outside.
even if you're outside in the winter, it's not going to happen.
Oh, that's great.
So definitely important for
Sure.
folks like that to get a supplement, a vitamin D supplement, and make sure those levels are up.
Yes.
And I think your own work has shown that depending on how much you take, the serum levels can vary quite.
Right. You
quite a
really
bit.
don't know
So
unless
really
you measure it.
You have to do a
Right.
measurement
You
occasionally.
really do. You really do.
To make sure what your the supplement you're taking is getting you to high enough levels.
Based on the speakers that I've heard thus far in this diet and optimum health, it appears that the world at large, or at least most of us, are so deficient in so many of the micronutrients that while I totally believe in this kind of transitional stage with even recognizing that vitamin D is important, you've got to measure it to start convincing people that, you're really deficient, you need to do something. It still seems like we have to aim towards some kind of public health strategy which provides these almost as a matter of course, and how we provide them is wide open right now. I mean, it's you can't do supplements for the world. It's not going to work.
Right.
It works for some people sometimes, whatever. We still have this scare campaign going on about being out in the sun, and yet that's where vitamin D
Right.
easily comes from,
Right.
so forth and so on. So, any ideas about some magic answers out
Magic
there?
answers.
Where are we going to get all these nutrients?
That's a good question. It's
Not my
something
problem,
I
he
think it's
says.
something we're grappling with.
Yes.
As how do you get people to change their ways?
Yes.
And maybe heed the advice
Right.
we're giving
Right.
them
Right.
based on research. I think it's a gradual process.
It is, isn't it?
And we just keep working on the education, outreach. The Linus Pauling Institute has a number of resources available for the public.
Right.
We have a micronutrient information center
Yes,
where
you
people
do.
can go and look up almost any micronutrient or nutrient that they're interested in. And there's a wealth of information there. And we try to sort of put the main points at the top of the page. And if you want to get more detail, you can go further down the website page. And we have there's a healthy youth program, which is looking to educate children in public schools. And let's see. Yeah, we have a newsletter and
you're on our board for
and people
like the Action Project.
We even take emails from the public and try to answer your questions.
You bet.
We have, but we do have a number of resources. And I think we're even reevaluating how we can reach more people.
Yes.
And we're always looking at that. And hopefully we get people to think about it and then maybe commit themselves to making some changes.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very, very much for sharing your information, your research, and your enthusiasm with us here today. We have more to come yet at the Linus Pauling Institute, and Dr. Gombart, thank you.
Thank you for your work.
And that's it for today's interview. We want to thank all of you for your time this morning and for your continued participation. We are actively seeking sponsors for these webinars, so if you're interested in sponsoring a session or contributing in any way, we encourage you to log on to joindaction.org today or email us at webinar@grassrootshealth.org. Please also tune in for next week's webinar with Dr. Vin Tengpricha of the Emory University School of Medicine, who will be speaking on improving clinical outcomes of cystic fibrosis with vitamin D. We look forward to having you join us again next week, and thank you.